let's get started. We'll see who might join additionally. It's going to be too many people for me to really see everybody on the Hollywood Squares format, I think. I may not put everyone on the screen. Let me see if I can access that. All right, so let me introduce myself and introduce the course just to get started. So I'm Chris Cutrone, the instructor for the course. And this course, Marx and Marxism, Critical Society, Philosophy and Modernity. It has several different titles. Marx and Marxism is the catchy title, so it's the main title listed in the course catalog. So at the School of the Art Institute, I've been teaching for over 20 years now, and this course I've been teaching for most of my time at SAIC. Sometimes it's been taught during the normal semester. Sometimes it's been taught in the January interim session, and more recently it's been the summer course that I teach. I generally teach in the departments of art history, theory and criticism, and visual and critical studies, and I teach critical theory. And capital C, capital T critical theory, which means Marxist critical theory. The courses that I teach most often at the Art Institute are on Adorno and Benjamin, the Frankfurt School thinkers, the Frankfurt School critical theorists, and we will see that this course ends on Adorno in our final week, and we'll talk a little bit about the Frankfurt School, one of the readings that we're doing in class today. I'll be able to introduce the Frankfurt School as one Marxist kind of institution in the 20th century. Okay, so let me share my screen with you guys, and we'll look at the syllabus together, just to give you guys a sense of the plot for the course. And the formal requirements of the course. I should also say that this course is based on another course that I used to teach regularly at the University of Chicago, where I taught for many years in the social sciences core curriculum. It was a 10-week course because of the quarter system that they have there, so it was a shorter version of this course. It didn't have all the Adorno at the end that we will have. And currently, besides teaching at SAIC, where I primarily teach, I also teach at the Institute for Clinical Social Work, which is based in Chicago. So I teach PhD students who are clinical social workers. I teach them epistemology, philosophy of science, but also the connection between Freudian psychoanalytic theory and Marxist social theory. We're not going to be getting too much into that aspect of things, the sort of Freud and Marx connection, but it will come up a little bit towards the end of the course. All right, so this course is organized in 3 general segments. So a 6-week course, the first 2 weeks will be on the thinkers before Marx that are influential for him. The middle 2 weeks, or the middle segment of the course, will be Marx's own writings. And then the final 2 weeks, or the final segment of the course, will be 20th century Marxist critical theorists. So we'll be starting tomorrow and Thursday with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Then next week we will do Adam Smith and Immanuel Kant and Benjamin Constant. And the final section of the pre-Marx writings will be Hegel on the following Monday, on the 21st. Then we'll do the rest of the middle 2 weeks on Marx. And then finally, in the last 2 weeks, we will be reading from Georg Lukács from his book History and Class Consciousness. We'll be reading just a little bit of Lenin on Karl Marx. We'll read Karl Korsch's essay on Marxism and philosophy. And then finally, in the last week of the course, we will be reading a bunch of writings by Theodor Adorno, including portions of his book Negative Dialectics. So what I will do to facilitate class discussion and also to introduce an asynchronous component to the course is that I'll be setting up discussion threads for each class session where everyone will be encouraged but not required to post just a few bullet points, like a few notes or questions or maybe short passages from the reading that you would like to call attention to, highlight, focus on in our class discussion. You will see that there's a writing assignment. So when it was a semester-long course, there were 3 short writing assignments. Because we only have 6 weeks, there'll just be 1 short writing assignment, and it will be a choice among the 3 topics: the pre-Marx writings that we'll be reading in the course, Marx's writings, and then finally the Marxists in the 20th century. And you will find the prompts for those writing assignments on Canvas in the file folder, paper assignments and course syllabus. And you'll see it has some crib notes there, suggestions for potential directions, but basically it's an opportunity for you to do a deep dive into 1 or 2 of the readings in the course, to try to extrapolate the implications of them. And it's, like I said, it's really an opportunity for you to work through one of the ideas or set of ideas in the course through writing about it. But we'll talk more about the writing assignment later after we're done with the first segment of the course. I have in the past had students volunteer to lead our discussions, so to be required rather than simply encouraged to post discussion notes to the threads that I'll set up on Canvas, but then also to verbally present them in class, so that we can have some dialogue initiated in discussing the readings. I do have some mini lectures on the readings prepared, but they'll really come in as motivated by our class discussion. So these are the formal requirements of the course. So given the number of students and the number of class sessions, I will take volunteers for teams of 2. We'll do it for the full week ahead of time, but we'll take volunteers on a rolling basis. So everyone will present at least once over the course of the 6 weeks. And then in terms of additional slots for volunteers, I will turn to my graduate students registered for the course and ask them to do second round of presentations after everyone else has had an opportunity to do so. But again, these are short, just bullet points on the readings, focusing on what you found to be of interest or what you had questions about or what you would like to focus on in our discussion in class. And so they're not meant to be summaries of the readings. We're going to assume that everyone has done all the reading. So you won't have to be comprehensive or to summarize everything, because that won't be possible, and it's not necessary, nor is it desirable. So the presentations will be short, 5 or 10 minutes. Again, just to kick us off and initiate discussion in the class. And we will have others will have posted notes to the discussion threads ahead of class that will also put some things on the table for us to look at from the reading. Questions about the formal requirements for the course? Anything unclear about that? Does that make sense? Okay, one thing that you will see on the syllabus, so I mentioned that I am teaching my social worker PhD students, including over the summer, which means that there will be some actual scheduling conflicts because I teach them in the evening. So you will see that some of the class sessions on the syllabus are marked with an asterisk. At least I hope that I included that. Oh, did I not? No, that's okay. Not here. I actually tell the social worker students I have asterisks where they're having the conflict. So what we're going to do to manage that, those will be on Tuesdays, but every other Tuesday. So there will only be 3 class sessions that will be affected for us. But unfortunately, the first of those will be tomorrow night. So we will have an abbreviated class session tomorrow night. We will only meet for an hour rather than for the 2 hours and 15 minutes or so, because we'll usually take a break midway in class. We won't go for the full 2.5 hours at one clip. We'll take a short break. And what I'd like to do, and I'll post this to the announcements, is ask you guys to meet at 6:30 rather than at 6:45. We'll meet for an hour until 7:30. And like I said, that will be tomorrow, Tuesday, July 8th. Then in 2 weeks, it will be on Tuesday, July 22nd. And then it will be 2 weeks after that, which brings us to August 5th. And those will be the 3 class sessions, but I'll remind you guys, I'll send announcements about that. And so on those 3 Tuesdays, we'll meet from 6:30 to 7:30. So we'll start a little bit earlier, and we'll end early just to give me time to meet with my social workers. They normally meet from 7 to 9. So I'm going to have abbreviated classes with them as well, from 7:30 to 9. Those are the logistical issues. I mentioned in the announcement on the syllabus that I posted to Canvas that there are preferred editions of the course books for purchase if you prefer to read books rather than PDFs off Canvas. Otherwise, all the readings are available on Canvas. So, and I think all the proper editions for the readings are available. Maybe not the Hegel. I have to double check. Oh no, in fact, the Rousseau is also, the Rousseau and Hegel are different editions than listed here. The Adam Smith, I think that I have multiple editions as PDFs, but I will highlight which one is the University of Chicago edition that we have as a PDF. The Marx Engels Reader, Lukács's History and Class Consciousness, and Adorno's Negative Dialectics will all be the proper versions listed on the syllabus. And when we get to Negative Dialectics, we will also have an alternate translation to the main book publication, translation done by a graduate student that is more accurate, but also a little bit more awkward as prose. So a little bit less readable, a little bit less punchy in terms of prose, but more accurate. And that is also available on Canvas. There will also be, apart from the readings in the books, some other short pieces not included in the books that are available as PDFs on Canvas. That would be Karl Korsch's Marxism and Philosophy, the Kant readings, the Benjamin Constant reading, and the Lenin. I don't think I'm forgetting anything. No, that's, yeah. And then, of course, the short readings that we're going to do in class today. All right, any questions so far? Okay, we won't meet for the entire class session today because the readings that we're doing in class are relatively short, but we're going to establish some themes for ourselves tonight to help just orient us and keep in mind what to be on the lookout for in the readings as we proceed. Because we have a shorter class session tomorrow, Rousseau's Discourse on the Origin of Inequality might be given a little bit short shrift in our discussion. However, we can carry that over to Thursday's discussion. So tomorrow we have our reading Rousseau's Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. On Thursday we'll be reading Rousseau's On the Social Contract. So we have two Rousseau readings that are foundational for the entire course this week, so that will make up for what we don't get to tomorrow night on Thursday night. And then we'll be proceeding to read Adam Smith for Monday and Tuesday of next week. Now, one thing that I'll say about a course structured like this one is over the summer is I would advise you guys to pace yourselves with respect to the readings. Meaning, I've tried to organize it so that the heaviest readings are for Monday rather than for Tuesday and Thursday. I've also tried to structure it so that the Tuesday readings are relatively shorter than the Monday and Thursday readings, just because there's not very much time between class sessions. But try to get a head start on the readings over the weekend for Monday and Tuesday. So pace yourselves. Try to read ahead if possible. And that will also be true next week with Adam Smith. We will have two large chunks of On the Wealth of Nations that we'll be reading. The longest section will be for Monday, but the Tuesday section will also be considerably long. Whereas the Thursday readings for next week are relatively short. So it's going to have that kind of a rhythm to the readings over the next 6 weeks. Okay, so what we have on tap for this evening, we're going to start with a piece by the Frankfurt School director, the director of the Institute for Social Research, Max Horkheimer. His short aphoristic essay, it's really a long aphorism, called The Little Man and the Philosophy of Freedom. And you will see it included in, there are other selections of aphorisms from Horkheimer in the first class session introduction folder in the files on Canvas. I'll share my screen with you guys and we'll look at this together. But just to introduce Horkheimer a little bit, he was the second director of the Institute for Social Research, and I'll talk a little bit about the Frankfurt School and who they were and how the Institute got started. Something that will actually, some history will come back to when we start doing the 20th century Marxists, when we read from Lenin and Lukács and course in the 5th week. So there was a major controversy within Marxism around World War I and then around the Russian Revolution that took place as a consequence of World War I in 1917. The previously unified, or mostly unified, Marxist movement was divided. And it's where we get the distinction between socialism and communism that we're familiar with from the 20th century, where the people who supported the Russian Revolution called themselves communists, and those who were more skeptical or opposed to the Russian Revolution called themselves socialists. However, the main Marxist party in the world before World War I was in Germany. It was the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SPD, which is still one of the major parties in Germany up to this day. They were, of course, the owners of Marx and Engels' literary estate. But the Russian Revolution put Marxists in charge in the Soviet Union, and they were taking the initiative in terms of leading a new mass movement of Marxism throughout the world, and they took it upon themselves to have a project of publishing all of Marx and Engels' writings, the collected works of Marx and Engels' writings. So they needed the archive to be copied and transferred from Berlin to Moscow. In Germany, in Weimar, Germany, after World War I, there were independent Marxist intellectuals who were, some of them were members of one party, the Social Democratic Party, others were members of the other party, the Communist Party, and yet others were members of smaller splinter groups that came out of this division between the socialists and the communists. And then there were non-party affiliated Marxist intellectuals. And they set up this Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt in order to have a place where Marxists of different political tendencies could collaborate. And they served as the intermediaries between the socialists' archive of Marx and Engels' writings in Germany and the communist collecting Marx and Engels' writings and publishing them in Moscow, in the Soviet Union. It's one of the main things that the Institute for Social Research was responsible for. But they also did other kinds of Marxist research into society, culture, and politics, mostly in the Weimar Republic, but also outside of Germany. Now, I mentioned that Max Horkheimer, who we'll be reading from in this first reading, he's the second director of the Institute. He takes over in 1930, and he's the one who really shapes the Institute as it became famous and had an influence. He was a personal acquaintance of Theodor Adorno, but also of Walter Benjamin, who you guys may have heard of from his essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. And like Benjamin and Adorno, Horkheimer was deeply influenced to take Marxism seriously intellectually by Georg Lukács's History and Class Consciousness, which we'll be reading from later in the course, which was published in 1923, around the time that the Institute got started. Okay, so this aphorism that we're reading, The Little Man and the Philosophy of Freedom, is from a collection of these mini essays by Horkheimer, published in 1931, written between 1926 and 1931. The book is called Dämmerung, which means twilight. It could mean either dusk or dawn. So it's between night and day. It could be the beginning of a day. It could be the end of a day. And it's written at around the time that the Great Depression, these aphorisms are written around the time that the Great Depression hit, and it hit Germany very hard. And so we'll see the examples that he uses here reflect that. Germany depended on loans from the United States to be able to pay back war reparations to Britain and France for World War I, who in turn needed those payments from Germany in order to pay the Americans back for the funding that the Americans gave them in World War I to fight that war. So when the Wall Street stock market crashed, this cycle of funding from the United States to Germany to France and Britain back to the United States collapsed. And it hit Germany maybe the hardest. Also hit the Soviet Union very hard. But that's a little bit of a different story. That produced the forced collectivization of agriculture and the crash industrialization program in the Soviet Union. The Great Depression necessitated that. Before that, they were depending more on international trade and foreign capital investment in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. So anyway, that's the immediate circumstance in which Horkheimer was writing this aphorism. It's also the period in which both the socialists and the communists thought that the Great Depression would lead to a renewed struggle for socialism, to overcome capitalism, but instead led to the triumph of the Nazis in Germany. And prior to that, there was the victory of fascism in Italy after World War I. But we'll talk about those things later on. Fascism isn't really figuring here. The other thing that I'll say about the Frankfurt School is that they probably had their greatest influence after World War II and in the English-speaking world fairly late, starting in the 1960s, but really in the 1970s and 80s. So in the aftermath of the New Left in the 1960s is when you had a strong English language and also just generally broader, wider reception outside of Germany, outside the German-speaking world, was starting in the 60s, but really afterwards. Now, I mentioned the Nazis. They took power in 1933. That meant that the Institute had to flee. They fled Germany, and some of them went to the UK. Most of them went to the United States, where they spent the war, and then they went back after World War II and reestablished the Institute in West Germany. Horkheimer and Adorno in particular did that. All right, let's look at this little man in the philosophy of freedom, which will basically lay out our fundamental ideas that we'll be exploring in the course. So here's Horkheimer. In socialism, freedom is to become a reality. But because the present system is called free and considered liberal, it is not terribly clear what this may mean. Yet anyone who keeps his eyes open and has a little money in his pocket actually has ample occasion to familiarize himself with this concept. He may, for example, ask an acquaintance for a job in his firm. That has nothing to do with philosophy. But his acquaintance knits his brow and says that is objectively impossible. Business is bad, he says, and he's even been obliged to let many employees go. The man should not be angry with him, for it is not within his power. His freedom doesn't extend that far. The businessman is subject to laws which neither he nor anyone else, nor any power with such a mandate created with purpose and deliberation. These are laws which the big capitalists and perhaps he himself skillfully make use of, but whose existence must be accepted as a fact. Boom, bust, inflation, wars, and even the qualities of things and of human beings that the present society demands are a function of such laws, of the anonymous social reality, just as the rotation of the earth expresses the laws of dead nature. No single individual can do anything about them. Bourgeois thought, and we'll come back to what bourgeois means in this context, bourgeois thought views this reality as superhuman. It fetishizes the social process. It speaks of fate. and either calls it blind or attempts a mystical interpretation. It deplores the meaninglessness of the whole or submits to the inscrutability of God's ways. But in actuality, all those phenomena which are either experienced as accidental or given a mystical interpretation depend on men and the way they arrange their social existence. They can therefore also be changed. If men consciously took their life and society in hand and replaced the struggle of capitalist enterprises by a classless and planned economy, the effects the process of production has on human beings and their relationships could also be understood and regulated. What today appears as a fact of nature in the private and business dealings of individuals are the effects of social life as a whole. They are human, not divine products. Because these effects of life in society are present but not conscious, willed, or controlled, and are the results of an equal number of individual wills that grasp neither their dependence nor their power, the limitation on individual freedom in our time is immeasurably greater than would be necessary given the available means. When the businessman whom his acquaintance asks for a job refuses because conditions don't permit it, he thinks he is referring to something purely objective and totally autonomous, reality itself. Since everyone else, including the petitioner, feels the same, because the reality they themselves created through their social activity appears as something alien by which they must abide, it follows that there are many agents, but no conscious and therefore free subjects of social conditions. No conscious and therefore free subjects. Men must submit to conditions they themselves constantly create as to something alien and overwhelmingly powerful. Insight is not enough, of course, to change this state of affairs, for the error is not that people do not recognize the subject, but that the subject does not exist. Everything, therefore, depends on creating the free subject that consciously shapes social life, and this subject is nothing other than the rationally organized socialist society which regulates its own existence. In the society as it now is, there are many individual subjects whose freedom is severely limited because they are unconscious of what they do, but there is no being that creates reality, no coherent ground. Religion and metaphysics claim that such a ground exists. In doing so, they try to keep men from creating it through their own efforts. Of course, the present lack of freedom does not apply equally to all. An element of freedom exists when the product is consonant with the interests of the producer. All those who work, and even those who don't, have a share in the creation of contemporary reality, but the degree of that consonance varies considerably. Those for whom it is high seem responsible for reality, in a sense. They speak of our reality as if they were royalty, and rightly so. For although they did not themselves create the world, one cannot but suspect that they would have made it exactly as it is. It suits them perfectly that the production and preservation of reality in our society proceed blindly. They have every reason to approve of the products of this blind process and therefore support all legends concerning its origin. But for the little man who is turned down when he asks for a job because objective conditions make it impossible, it is most important that their origin be brought to the light of day, so that they do not continue being unfavorable to him. Not only his own lack of freedom, but that of others as well spells his doom. His interest lies in the Marxist clarification of the concept of freedom. All right, we're going to see that that last sentence is our task in this course. So our task in this course is the Marxist clarification of the concept of freedom. Let me highlight some things from this aphorism that give us some indications about where we're going to be going in the course. So he uses this language of what we're going to be addressing as alienation. And alienation is a concept associated with Marx, but actually predates Marx. We will see that Rousseau, Kant, and Hegel also use this concept of alienation. Adam Smith doesn't use that term or that concept exactly, but he uses something very similar to it. So the idea that humans, because that's what man means here. In German, man is a gender-neutral word. So they have 3 genders in German grammar. They have male, female, and they have neuter. So das Mann just means person or human, and mankind means humanity. So it's a little bit less gendered than it is in English translation. Because, of course, socialists were always, going back before Marx, socialists were always for gender equality, and for women's liberation and for sexual liberation and all the good things that we associate with later history. Actually, people were already there in the early 1800s. And Marx and Engels inherited that from the earlier socialist movement. So alienation, an alienated society. So what it means to say that the society is capitalist, it means that it's dominated by capital. And what we'll see when we get to Marx defines capital as alienated labor, as self-alienated labor. In other words, not alienated in the sense of alienated from someone by someone else, but rather self-alienated, meaning there's something about the way we do things in the society that alienates us from our freedom in this society. Now, this concept of freedom is tricky because we associate it, our colloquial association of freedom is, our first association with it is personal liberty. In other words, it's about individual people having the right to do what they choose. It's about a kind of scope of action and choice. That's not how we're going to be addressing freedom primarily. In this course, we're going to be looking at social freedom. So, meaning individual liberty is a function of social freedom. Meaning, how does society change? It changes through the actions of individuals, but society creates the conditions in which those individuals act. So this is where he gets the idea that there are many agents, but there's no subject. And then he says, well, we have to create the subject, and what would that subject be? It would be the socialist society that consciously regulates its own existence. So we have a kind of redundant phrase, a socialist society, or a disalienated society. We could use that term. Meaning, capitalism is a society dominated by capital, whereas society should rule itself. So we could say that this society rules itself in an alienated way, and one way that appears is in terms of the way society is dominated by the imperatives, the needs of capital. And we'll get into what all that means. One of the things that Horkheimer is using to illustrate and highlighting is unemployment. So capitalism is a society that requires people to work in order to live, but also through technology is never able to provide everyone a job. So there's endemic chronic unemployment. Frederick Jameson, who recently passed away, who was a important Marxist cultural critic in the United States and literary critic, he once said that if you needed to sum up Marxism and its view of capitalism in one word, it would be unemployment. So what we will see is that capitalism is defined by Marxism in a very specific way. It traces it back to the Industrial Revolution, which is conventionally dated between 1750 and 1850. Starts in England, and then spreads after the French Revolution to Western Europe. That's the first industrial revolution. That's the steam engine industrial revolution. That's when automation is introduced into production and starts putting people out of work. Now, I mentioned that we're going to define this word bourgeois that he uses, and that Marxists use, but not only Marxists. So bourgeois, it doesn't mean bougie. It doesn't mean rich people. It doesn't mean the wealthy. It means, bourgeois in French means urban. So it means the city folk or the town folk. So in English we have burghers, B-U-R-G-H-E-R. We had in the American colonies the House of Burgesses. So it means the city folk or the town folk. So bourgeois means urban. So why is that significant? Well, it refers to bourgeois society. And bourgeois society has a different history than capitalism. So if capitalism goes back to the Industrial Revolution, so really 250 years, bourgeois society goes further back. It goes back to the Renaissance, to the free city-states of Europe, in Italy and in the Northern Renaissance, in the Hanseatic League. So it is the new society, the new social relations that develop in these new free city-states of medieval Europe in the late Middle Ages that give birth to the Renaissance. So it's bourgeois society as opposed to what? As opposed to traditional civilization. Traditional civilization, by contrast, was an agricultural subsistence civilization in which production and reproduction took place in the countryside, in which the main activity of society is in farming and in rural life. It's in the village. So it's a society in traditional civilization, and this is true throughout the world. It's true in all the classical civilizations of Europe, Asia, Africa, the Western Hemisphere. So at the time of Columbian contact, Columbus's quote-unquote discovery of the New World, the Western Hemisphere was dominated by two major civilizations, the Aztecs and the Incas, Mexico and Peru. All traditional civilizations throughout the world had the same structure, which is a structure of settled agriculture in which 95% of the people were farmers or peasants. But that peasant society that engaged in subsistence agriculture was dominated by a caste system, the top caste being the priestly caste or the religious leaders. In Western Europe, the church. And the second caste were the aristocrats. They're the warrior caste. They're the nobility. They're the feudal nobility, the ones who feud amongst each other. So like I said, throughout the world, in India, China, in Africa, in Islam, in Europe, in the Incas and the Aztecs, same structure. The top caste is the priestly caste. The subordinate ruling caste is the warrior caste. And then they rule over a society that's mostly peasants. There are some artisans as well. Artisans organized in traditional guilds. So it's a subsistence system of agriculture. This is something that arose in what's called the Neolithic Revolution, or the Agricultural Revolution, that took place about 10,000 years ago, in which humans throughout the world switched from being hunters and gatherers to being settled farmers. Marxism refers to that earlier condition, the hunters and gatherers, as primitive communism. The reason it's called primitive communism is that it didn't have a caste system, it didn't have a class hierarchy. And pretty much everyone, all the men hunted, all the women gathered, then there were some revered elders and there were some special shamans, but generally it was an egalitarian society, although Engels, Marx's colleague, called hunter and gatherer communities the world historic defeat of women because it has a gendered division of labor in which men and women do different things, and so there's a kind of, might be a hierarchy there in the gendered division of labor with the hunting and gathering, perhaps. Actually, very different from the way we would think about gender hierarchy. But it wasn't yet a class society in the way that came to be the case with the agricultural revolution. And that class society was really a caste system. And it's a caste system that seems to be justified by religion. It seems to be justified by a divine order to the cosmos, to the universe. So bourgeois society is the end of that. 10,000 years of caste systems throughout the world. Bourgeois society is the dissolution of the caste system. It's the overthrow of the authority of the church and the nobility. In Europe, it involved the breaking of the power of the Catholic Church in the Protestant Reformation and the Protestant Revolt, which entailed about 100 years of religious wars in which millions of people died. There's serious depopulation of Central Europe due to the religious wars of the Protestant Reformation. And we'll talk about this when we get to Rousseau. Rousseau is from one of the Protestant republics that emerges through the Protestant Reformation. So a kind of center of bourgeois life, because Protestantism is associated with the rise of the bourgeoisie, the town folk. Switzerland. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 recognizes two republics, the Dutch Republic and the Swiss Republic. They're the two republics that are recognized in modern Europe as a function of the Protestant Reformation. And soon after that, there's a civil war in England in which they briefly had a parliamentary republic before the monarchy was restored again. So bourgeois society is modern society, and it's a society based on production not for subsistence, but for trade and commerce. So in bourgeois society, as opposed to traditional civilization, people do not consume what they produce. They produce for trade, and they get through trade the things that they themselves consume. So they get their subsistence from other people's production in trade. Now, I mentioned the Protestant Reformation. So one of the major theological innovations of Protestantism, the heresy of Protestantism according to the old church, the Catholic Church, is what's called the Protestant work ethic, meaning the idea that God requires us to work not only as punishment for disobeying him in the Garden of Eden, but actually to contribute to God's creation, to improve the world. The Catholic Church thought this was a heresy, but the Protestants put the work ethic at the center of their theology. So, work, a society of labor, is central to bourgeois civilization. The Industrial Revolution is a crisis of that civilization. It's a crisis of the work ethic, because how can you really have a viable work ethic, a society based on the work ethic, when technology is constantly putting people out of work? That's capitalism, according to Marxism. And what that means is that capitalism is a crisis of bourgeois society that points beyond it. It's a crisis of a society of labor that points beyond the society of labor. So communism is meant to be a situation in which the social imperative to work is replaced by people working out of desire rather than out of need. And we'll look at what that means through some of the other writings that we're looking at tonight. Okay, so alienation means, so how did this come about? How did the Industrial Revolution happen? It's a complicated story because it's bound up with the class struggle. In other words, in bourgeois society, the workers assert their rights. And one of the results of the workers asserting their rights in bourgeois society is to give a great impetus to technological innovation and production. So in fact, the class struggle of the workers ends up undermining the workers' position in society because it spurs technological innovation, which ends up creating unemployment. And Rosa Luxemburg, someone that we'll talk about later in the course, she, and not only her, but depending on Marx and Engels, she has this idea that the class struggle began in 1831. The modern class struggle of the proletariat began in 1831 when the workers smashed the machines to protest against being put out of work by technology. So the Luddites. There was, of course, a class struggle before that, but it wasn't the modern class struggle of a proletarianized working class against the capitalists. One major difference between capitalism and bourgeois society is that in bourgeois society, the workers own the means of production. They own their own tools, and they also have their own skills. Whereas in capitalism, capital becomes the property in the means of production. So workers cease to own the means of production because they become, the means of production become machines that you need a great deal of capital in order to purchase and own. And labor requires far less developed skills. So workers are more replaceable in the production process. Okay. Now, like I said, this points beyond capitalism to what Marx called communism. But really, we don't know, according to Marx, we don't know what communism will be. We just know it as a negation of the current state of affairs. We don't know it as, we don't have like a definite image of it. One of the reasons for that, which we'll talk about later, is that the early socialist movement in the 1800s, in the 19th century, the utopian socialists, they had very elaborate schemes for what a socialist society should look like based on technological possibilities. But actually their image of an emancipated society through technology ended up just being a forecast of what industrial capitalism would become later. Right, so they ended up forecasting not socialism or communism, but rather capitalism. All right, so next I'd like to look at the Louis Menand, Marx and Engels as philosophes of a second Enlightenment. One of the things that I was referring to just a little while ago is something that we'll talk about more tomorrow and Thursday. There's a timeline that I've provided for you guys going over that kind of long view of history that Marxism has, and that Marxism doesn't have, only Marxism doesn't have this, but rather this is a kind of standard anthropological and archaeological account of longue durée, long human history. So what I mentioned about primitive communism and the hunter-gatherers, and then the rise of traditional civilization through the Neolithic Revolution, a society of peasants replacing the society of hunter-gatherers, and then bourgeois society as a society of work, and then the Industrial Revolution as a kind of post-bourgeois society of proletariat, proletariat, or those who do proletarianized labor, and that this is a society dominated by capital that nonetheless points to something beyond it, even though we don't know exactly what it will be. We only know how it will fulfill a certain negation of capitalism. So we have some catchphrases from Marx about that. Capital is the moving contradiction. Communism is the real movement of history, but is the real movement of history within capitalism. And that the proletariat is the embodiment of the negative principle of capitalism. So all these kind of strange Hegelian formulations that Marx wrote, which we'll be getting into when we read Hegel 2 Mondays from now. But let's look at the Louis Menand short summary of the Marxist view of things. It's in the folder Meaning in History. I'll share my screen with you guys. We'll have this, and then we'll have a short paragraph by Marx, who will give it to us, the same idea in more arch Hegelian philosophical language. So here's Louis Menand. So who is Louis Menand? He is a present-day intellectual historian, teaches at Columbia University, also a cultural critic and commentator. He writes for the New York Times and for the New Yorker and other journals. Occasionally makes media appearances. Not a Marxist, a kind of progressive liberal. He wrote the introduction to the republication of a book. That republication of this book that we'll be looking at this introduction from was around the time I started teaching, 2003. The book is a book by Edmund Wilson. He's part of the same generation. He's a contemporary of the Frankfurt School. He even knew some of them. He was a New York intellectual in the 1930s and 40s who was in the orbit of the Communist Party and other Marxist tendencies. He wrote a book called To the Finland Station. It was a history of socialism from the French Revolution to the Russian Revolution. So originally published in 1940, republished again in 1972, and then finally in 2003. Finland Station refers to the train station in St. Petersburg that Lenin arrived at when he came back from exile to lead the Russian Revolution in 1917. Okay, so here's Louis Menand, and so he's not a Marxist, but he wrote an introduction to a book that deals with the history of Marxism, and he kind of summed up Marxism very accurately in a way that I find helpful. So here's Louis Menand. He says, in pre-modern societies, those would be pre-bourgeois or traditional societies, the ends of life are given at the beginning of life. People do things in their generation so that the same things will continue to be done in the next generation. Meaning is immanent in all the ordinary customs and practices of existence. Immanent meaning within, inherent within, all the ordinary customs and practices of existence, since these practices are inherited from the past and are therefore worth reproducing. The idea is to make the world go not forward, only around. In modern societies, by contrast, the ends of life are not given at the beginning of life. They are thought to be created or discovered. The reproduction of the customs and practices of the group is no longer the chief purpose of existence. The idea is not to repeat, but to change, to move the world forward. Meaning is, therefore, no longer immanent in the practices of ordinary life, since those practices are understood by everyone to be contingent and time-bound. This is why death in modern societies is the great taboo and absurdity, the worst thing one can imagine. For at the close of life, people cannot look back and know that they have accomplished the task set for them at birth. This knowledge always lies up ahead, somewhere over history's horizon. Modern societies don't know what will count as valuable in the conduct of life in the long run, because they have no way of knowing what conduct the long run will find itself in a position to respect. The only certain knowledge death comes with is the knowledge that the values of one's own time, the values one has tried to live by, are expungible. Marxism gave a meaning to modernity. It said that, wittingly or not, the individual performs a role in a drama that has a shape and a goal, a trajectory, and that modernity will turn out to be just one act in that drama. Historical change is not arbitrary. It is generated by class conflict. It is faithful to an inner logic. It points toward an end, which is the establishment of the classless society. Marxism was founded on an appeal for social justice, but there were many forms that such an appeal might have taken. Its deeper attraction was the discovery of meaning, a meaning in which human beings might participate in history itself. When Edmund Wilson explained in his introduction to the 1972 edition of To the Finland Station that his book had been written under the assumption that an important step in progress has been made, that a fundamental breakthrough had occurred, this is the faith he was referring to. Marx and Engels were the philosophes of a second Enlightenment. Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. So what does it mean to say the ends of life are given at the beginning of life? So I mentioned the caste system. The caste system means that everyone does what their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents did, generally speaking. Peasants remain peasants. Feudal lords remain feudal lords. Craftspeople remain craftspeople. It's passed down from parent to child in families. It's a caste system. Now, sometimes peasant children are taken up, or adopted by guild craft artisans. The church recruits from the aristocracy. So the old Catholic system was that the first child inherits the family's estate. The first child inherits the feudal aristocratic title. The second son becomes a priest. That's how the church remained in control. They took hostages from the aristocratic families. That's how they maintained their supremacy. So the church recruits people. They also recruited from artisan families and other more notable people, sometimes recruited out of the peasantry, but generally recruited from the aristocracy. So generally commoners were commoners, and then aristocrats were aristocrats, and mostly the church was derived from aristocrats. So that means that everyone knew what their mission in life was. Their mission in life was to be a farmer, or a carpenter, or a blacksmith, or a stonemason. Or, in those societies that had merchant castes, a merchant, as your parents and grandparents did before you. If you were a feudal aristocrat, you're a warrior, and therefore you are to be a prince, you're to be a warrior or a princess, a warrior in either case. You're supposed to engage in that kind of political sphere of warfare and courtly drama. You know what your purpose in life is. is to go out in a blaze of glory, if you're an aristocrat. Similarly, if you are part of the church clergy, then you know what your purpose is. The ends of your life, the purpose of your life is given to you. You're supposed to preserve the teachings of the church and commune with God and figure out God's intentions through that preservation of the heritage of the religion. So modern society, by contrast, because it breaks all those traditional practices, it breaks traditional religion, it breaks the aristocracy, and it breaks traditional guildcraft artisanship. It also frees the peasants who were tied to the land. And people instead have to figure out their own way in life. So we would consider ourselves to be unfree if we had to do what our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents did. Back then it was the opposite. Back then, if you weren't permitted by circumstance to do what your parents did, that would be considered unfreedom. So freedom would be the freedom to practice your religion, practice your tradition, follow in your parents' footsteps. If people are conquered by another people, if they're enslaved, if they're subjugated, then they are separated from their tradition, and then that is considered unfreedom. So Moses, let my people go, let the Jews out of bondage in Egypt, means let us be what we were meant to be traditionally. Because being conquered and enslaved by the Egyptians meant they weren't able to practice their tradition, and therefore they were unfree. Modern bourgeois society is in some ways the opposite. Freedom means the freedom to break from tradition, rather than the freedom to uphold it. And again, from the Marxist perspective, this means the breaking of the caste system. Freeing of social production. And in that way, freeing society. Okay, let's see what Marx has to say in the same vein, because he has a very similar formulation, although much more opaquely delivered in terms of the language of it. So we have just a one-paragraph selection from one of the books we'll be reading from in the Marx Engels reader, and that is the Grundrisse, the Foundation. It's the notes that he was writing towards eventually what he wrote, Das Kapital. We have an alternate translation of the key sentence up front, but we'll just read the main paragraph. Here's Marx. The ancient conception, by which he means the old conception, in which man always appears, in however narrowly national, religious, or political a definition, as the aim of production, seems very much more exalted than the modern world, in which production is the aim of man and wealth the aim of production. So what does he mean? So in the old way of doing things, in traditional civilization, in the ancient conception, there is a definite goal for all social activity, and that is to reproduce a definite form of humanity, however that might be defined, in national terms, in religious terms, or in political terms. Political terms meaning the ancient polis, like Aristotle's view of Athens as an autonomous city-state, as a polis, which again was a polis of the aristocrats, meaning not everyone participated in that political sphere. Women didn't, and the peasants and the slaves did not. So in the ancient conception, production, everything that people do, the activity in society, is all aimed at reproducing, preserving, and continuing that traditional way of life, the practices, that define that existence. Again, either defined nationally, religiously, or politically. And because there's a definite goal, because the ends of life are given at the beginning of life, that seems to be more exalted than in the modern bourgeois world, where there's a reversal of means and ends. So everything was a means to a definite end, a kind of culturally valued form of life in the old traditional civilization. In modern society, by contrast, production is an end in itself. And wealth is the aim of production, meaning production for its own sake and increasing production, the pursuit of wealth, production for the sake of production, production for the sake of developing production. He says, in fact, however, when the narrow bourgeois form has been peeled away, what is wealth? If not the universality of needs, capacities, enjoyments, productive powers, etc., of individuals produced in universal exchange? What, if not the full development of human control over the forces of nature, those of his own nature as well as those of so-called nature? What, if not the absolute elaboration of his creative dispositions, without any preconditions other than antecedent historical evolution, which make the totality of this evolution, the evolution of all human powers as such, unmeasured by any previously established yardstick, an end in itself? What is this, if not a situation where man does not reproduce in any determined form, but produces his totality? Where he does not seek to remain something formed by the past, but is in the absolute movement of becoming. In bourgeois political economy, and in the epoch of production to which it corresponds, this complete elaboration of what lies within man appears as the total alienation, and the destruction of all fixed one-sided purposes as the sacrifice of the end in itself to a wholly external compulsion. Hence, in one way, the childlike world of the ancients appears to be superior. And this is so insofar as we seek for closed shape, form, and established limitation. The ancients provide a narrow satisfaction, whereas the modern world leaves us unsatisfied, or where it appears to be satisfied with itself is vulgar and mean. So the wholly external compulsion is, of course, capitalism, the need to accumulate wealth in the form of capital. But production for its own sake, production as an end in itself, is actually freedom. It's what he calls the absolute movement of becoming, unmeasured by any previously established yardstick, and with the only basis prior historical evolution, prior historical development. And this is when we don't seek to remain something formed by the past. That's the idea. So production for the sake of production becomes alienated, becomes production for the sake of capital. And again, we're going to get into the details of what all these things mean in our further readings. So this is just to establish some sort of themes, some ideas, just to flag for you guys what to be on the lookout for in terms of what we'll be reading, what are the core ideas we're going to be exploring. Okay, here's one other reading, which is a bit longer, and this was published around the same time as the Louis Menand introduction to Edmund Wilson's To the Finland Station on the History of Socialism. This is by Robert Pippin, actually a professor of mine at the University of Chicago. He's a Hegel scholar, and he was responding to a questionnaire that was circulated among the editorial board and other invited guests to respond to a journal called Critical Inquiry. So the title of this short piece is called On Critical Theory and Critical Inquiry being the name of the journal, A Short History of Non-Being. So he's on the editorial board of this journal, published out of the University of Chicago, Critical Inquiry, actually an important journal for publishing translations from the Frankfurt School thinkers, from Adorno and others. So here's what Robert Pippin said. What's the current state and future of critical theory? In 2003, he says, other editorial board members, I expect, will comment on the state of matters critical in literature and the arts. There is also, of course, the issue of the status of a critical theory of society. So I wanted to say something about the state and future of critical theory an sich, which means as such, essentially the left Hegelian Marxist Frankfurt School tradition, although the notion has become broad enough so that even the likes of Heidegger and his influential legacy and army of epigones are relevant. So what does that refer to? So Heidegger, who was an anti-Marxist philosopher, who ended up being a supporter of the Nazis in Germany, he left an intellectual legacy after World War II that we associate now with postmodernism. So he had a huge impact on French thought. So Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze, also others like Jacques Lacan and Louis Althusser, who was a Communist Party intellectual, and others, are following Heidegger. Also Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist philosopher, follower of Heidegger. And generally speaking, then, in the English-speaking world, that French theory has had a huge impact. So I refer to these people as the French fries, the Heideggerian, the influential legacy and army of epigones of Heidegger. So the anti-Marxists have taken over critical theory, according to Robert Pippin, whereas it used to be the Marxists' Frankfurt School tradition. Now it also includes all these other things. He says, but I won't try... he says, there are obvious implications for contemporary literary theory, but I won't try to get into that. This will just be an attempt to identify what he calls the still unsolved problem. Oh, there's one. It will have to be breathless, and I'm not entirely sure it is relevant, but here goes. And I'm going to skip some things along the way, but we'll get the core of what he's saying. He says, the historical dimension first. He says, I understand critical theory, or perhaps even literary criticism, to be at its core a post-Kantian phenomenon. That is, very much a legacy of the original Kantian idea of critical philosophy. A critique by reason of itself. He says the basic claim is that first philosophy, or what's known as prima philosophia, first philosophy, the foundation of all pre-modern university learning and all pre-modern science, was not in fact any longer regarded as first. Rather, a critical account of the possibility of any such foundation, or any other claim to know, any kind of epistemology, was first necessary. What then does it mean to see Kant, or the Kantian moment, as the hinge on which something quite new in the history of philosophy and social and perhaps aesthetic theory swings open? So Kant is writing in the late 1700s. The most important result of the all-destroying Kant was the destruction of metaphysics as traditionally understood. So Horkheimer had said that religion and metaphysics tries to keep us from creating the free society. Kant is the beginning of the destruction of traditional metaphysics. Pippin says philosophy, which means non-empirical claims to know, meaning can we have faculties of knowing the world before we've experienced anything? So is there something a priori, the a priori knowledge of substance? Could not be understood as first philosophy still understood it, or prima philosophia, or traditional philosophy understood it, to be about the world or things in themselves, but rather had to be reconceived as concerned with our mode of knowledge of objects. Meaning it's not in the world or things in themselves, but rather in us. So philosophy, its real object is our own faculties. It's not the world, but how we experience the world. Our subjectivity of the world is what philosophy's true subject is. Let me jump ahead here. The most important result for later critical theory concerned the status of necessity in philosophy. What makes philosophy necessary? Or Kant's attempt to argue that some philosophical account of the once and for all necessary conditions of knowledge was possible. To make a very long story very short, after Kant, while the critical attack on the very possibility of first philosophy survived, this faith in a formal philosophy, capable of delivering an epistemological form of necessary truth, did not. Retaining the notion of a subjective contribution to, a subjective legislation of, and a subjective possibility of representational content, or all aspects of human experience fraught with oughts, and I'll come back to what that means in a minute, but without the necessity or fixity, meant that it wasn't long before the most important aspect of the Kantian aftermath was apparent. Hegel's famous claim in the preface to the Philosophy of Right that philosophy is its own time comprehended in thoughts, or that every philosopher is essentially a child of his time. This all meant that some new way of conceiving of philosophy, adequate to the realization of the radically historical nature of the human condition, was now necessary, especially one that could distinguish in some way what was central, elemental, essential, in some way that on which other quite variable and much more contingent aspects of human historical time depended. The problem of understanding properly, especially critically, conceptual, artistic, and social change was henceforth at the forefront of much European philosophy. Jump ahead. He says, for it was also the time as this consensus was building about historicity, post-metaphysical philosophy, and so forth, that some consensus was also building in European high culture that the modern form of life coming into view after the middle of the 19th century, so circa 1850 or so, was in some basic way unacceptable, unaffirmable, pathological even, certainly ugly. So capitalism, as the result of all this change that it was taking place, that philosophers took it upon themselves to try to understand, there was a consensus building in the mid-1800s that capitalism was a pathological, ugly, unaffirmable, and unacceptable form of existence. He says, a recoil most dramatically first obvious much earlier in Rousseau, in the 1750s. To cut to the chase, it then became obvious how difficult it would be to theorize, as it is now put, the gap or absence or lack in this new comprehensive form of life. So if capitalism is pathological, unaffirmable, unacceptable, and certainly ugly, we still don't know what to replace it with. Let me jump ahead here. He says, this meant that the problem of critical theory turned out to be connected to a very old problem, indeed the oldest, long ago called the problem of non-being, how to say what is not without saying nothing. Goes back to pre-Socratic philosophy, so before Plato, the pre-Socratic philosophers that were so influential for Heidegger and also Nietzsche and others, and also for Marx, by the way. So how to say what is not without saying nothing. In this case, it is the problem of theorizing what was historically missing, absent, or simply not in this historical moment, and understanding the nature of its claim on our attention. Or how to understand, theorize the recoil or aversion to modernity already apparent in Romanticism, that's Hölderlin's Nostalgia and other Romantic productions, and more in evidence in Kierkegaard's The Present Age, Nietzsche's Death of God, and so forth. So in the 19th century, you have a kind of crack up of philosophy with Kierkegaard and Nietzsche that gives rise to 20th century existentialism. Formulating an adequate account of what was missing, unrealized, or just unacceptable in these altered conditions of modernity proved difficult and provoked ever more radical solutions. He says, I think this problem remains poorly understood and hardly yet well worked out. And he says, Adorno's negative dialectics and attempted recovery of the non-identical comes as close as anyone to realizing the generality and difficulty of the post-idealist dimensions of the problem. Something that we'll get to later in the course. And he says, and not in the most radical response to the problem has this been worked out, namely Heidegger's. What is sought is some sense of the falseness, not merely of contemporary philosophical positions, but of everyday life itself. So the falseness is not just in our way of thinking about things, it's in life itself. The falseness, deceptiveness, thoughtlessness, and forgetfulness of the ordinary itself. And he says, and all of this without a reinstallation of traditional reality appearance distinctions. Heidegger came up with a novel, explosive account of the inherent nothingness of the everyday world, its potential for an episodic, largely inexplicable breakdown in anxiety and homelessness, and then proposed a vast novel ontological account as a way of thinking through the implications of this distinct fragility and groundlessness. So much for a short history of non-being. He says, I only mean that I think critical theory still needs an account of what isn't in what is, and still needs to understand the dimensions of this problem as an interconnected problem from Kant on appearance, Hegel on dialectic and teleology, Marx on contradiction, so those we will all be dealing with, Kierkegaard on despair, Nietzsche on the nihil and nihilism, we won't be dealing with that, Adorno on negative dialectics we will be dealing with, and Heidegger on nichts, or nothingness. We won't be dealing with that either. We'll be dealing with that only tangentially via Adorno's critique of Heidegger. He says, in fact, I would say at the level of discussion and awareness of this issue, in its historical dimensions, with respect both to the history of critical theory and the history of modernization, has regressed. And then he goes through the failures that he sees in more recent history by Habermas, by Foucault, by deconstructionists, and by post-colonial theory and new historicism. And then he says, so it is now possible to say that the problem with contemporary critical theory, again 20 years ago, is that it has become insufficiently critical. So critical theory has become uncritical. He says, I should say that I still believe that the Hegelian response to the situation, post-metaphysical philosophy, radical historicity, modernist dissatisfactions, or we could say dissatisfactions with modernity, is the most promising. It is tagged by such phrases as the causality of fate, internal critique, which we'll be talking about, immanent critique, and determinate negation, and usually involves a three-stage claim. The lack or gap or failure in question is initially the obvious one. A community is not living up to its own ideals, or cannot, as in tragic situations. This is then said to have unavoidable experiential consequences, a kind of suffering due to its own unreason. And this feature, of course, is why attention to contemporary literature and art can become so theoretically important, as a way of evincing and beginning to diagnose such suffering. And then the most difficult claim, that the status of the ideal not being lived up to by the community is something like the best we've been able to do so far. And so it is not just a fact about a local community at such a stage that it cannot live up to its own ideal. That failure has significance beyond its local meaning, all of which forces on stage the difficult issue of the referent of the community, so described, and the now tired issue of grand narratives. Regardless of how all this might be worked out, there is also a historical cost for the neglect or underattention or lack of resolution of this core critical problem: repetition. Essentially, the cost is the rather mysterious repetition, now over several generations, of a number of the original moments of recoil, revulsion, and alienation among the founding formulations in modernism. How long can art be about the end of art? Why did modernist art turn it to itself as its subject? How many iterations of what is essentially 19th century French bourgeois self-hatred are possible in the novel before we exhaust that moment? It may seem extreme to claim, well, to claim at all that such repetition exists, that postmodernism, say, is an instance of such repetition, and also to claim that it is tied somehow to the dim understanding we have of the post-Kantian situation with respect to, let's say, the necessary conditions for the possibility of what isn't. But however sketchy that is what I wanted to suggest, I'm not sure will get us anywhere. Philosophy rarely does. Perhaps philosophy exists to remind us that we haven't gotten anywhere. Okay, some of this is a little bit arch. It's a little bit opaque. So let's unpack that a bit. So fraught with odds. I'm going to pull up a chart of terms for us to keep in mind that we'll be following throughout the course. We had this term becoming that Marx introduced, and now we have ought, the ought that Pippin introduces. Now what he's saying about what is missing or what's absent, what isn't and what is, so this is a little bit of a euphemism or kind of code language. So of course, if he's saying that it's the Hegelian, the left Hegelian, Marxist, Frankfurt School tradition, then what isn't and what is socialism and capitalism. That's what it means. In other words, if capitalism is the pathological situation, then the suffering from an unrealized potential, what isn't, that doesn't exist yet, but is in the process of being realized, and is therefore not nothing, would be socialism, or what Marx early on called communism. Right, so that's the stakes of it. Now, postmodernism means that we've given up on that, and instead we're just sort of spiraling in the nothingness of capitalism, in the nihilism of capitalism. And that's why he brings in the grand narrative of history. Because, of course, the grand narrative of history that postmodernism attacked was Marxism. Marxism is the grand narrative of history. Meaning the idea that what we're living through is a transition to a future society beyond capitalism. Right, so, again, what's missing, what's absent, but what ought to be would be socialism within capitalism. Now, he brings up modernism in art and literature, and so I have a little illustration of that, just to give ourselves a sense of what he's talking about, by a modernist poet, and that is Rilke. So let me bring this up and share it with you guys. Rilke, who's a German modernist poet from around the turn of the 20th century, so circa 1900. I think this poem is from 1908. The Archaic Torso of Apollo. So, in very romantic terms, so what does the Archaic Torso of Apollo refer to? It refers to like fragments of statuary from ancient Greece and Rome, from ancient Greece in particular, where the head and the arms and the legs have been lopped off. Maybe the genitals have been lopped off as well. By iconoclasts. Apollo, who was the god of form. So Apollo is the sun god. He rides his chariot across the sky and he casts out rays of light, and those rays of light give form to the world. So it's the god of form who's represented by something which is just a fragmentary, broken form, the torso. So here's Rilke. We cannot know his legendary head, with eyes like ripening fruit, and yet his torso is still suffused with brilliance from inside, like a lamp, in which his gaze, now turned to low, gleams in all its power. Otherwise the curved breast could not dazzle you so, nor could a smile run through the placid hips and thighs to that dark center where procreation flared. Otherwise this stone would seem defaced beneath the translucent cascade of the shoulders, and would not glisten like a wild beast's fur, would not from all the borders of itself burst like a star. For here there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life. That's the modernism. In other words, you start out with a broken fragment of something, a broken tradition, and you try to reconstruct it in your imagination. You try to give form to the fragmentary, broken statue. And in that process of reconstructing the broken form with your imagination, you realize you must change your life. So that's the modernism. That's the modernist dissatisfaction. And that's the idea that we're tasked. Okay, so how do we think about that task? And that's where this chart of terms that I have, it's under the additional readings. I'll share my screen with you guys so we can look at this together and we can unpack some of these terms that these readings have put on the table for us. So first of all, freedom. What do we mean by freedom? So I mentioned that we don't just mean individual liberty, not just choice in a scope of action, but rather more general social freedom. So what does that refer to? It refers to freedom to change. So you'll notice that Robert Pippin said, really modern philosophy, critical philosophy, critique, is about change. So why would philosophy take up change as its main object in the late 1700s with Kant? Well, because of all the change that had taken place in the preceding centuries. In other words, in Kant's time, it's an era of revolution. In recent history, there is the Renaissance, the breaking of the medieval world. There's the Protestant Reformation, a total revolution within Christianity. There's the Enlightenment, broadly understood, including the scientific revolution. There's, of course, the circumnavigation of the globe by Europeans. So there's the grasping of the universality of humanity. And then there are these revolutions. There's the Dutch revolt that takes place during the Protestant Reformation against the Spanish monarchy. There's the English Civil War. There are the American and French revolutions. So massive upheaval taking place over the preceding several hundred years. And then the question is, philosophy seems to be about describing what is the case, whereas really philosophy needs to think about not just a state of being, but a process of becoming. So philosophy's true object, according to Kant, is what it really has to think about is freedom. And freedom understood as transformation. So I mentioned ancient conception of freedom. That would be Aristotle's conception of freedom. Aristotle's conception of freedom is, can a being realize itself? Is a seed free from external constraint to grow into the plant that it's supposed to be? So it's a freedom to be. So I mentioned Moses, let my people go, let my people be what they are. That's ancient freedom, freedom to be what you are. Modern freedom, by contrast, is the freedom to become, to change. It's not the freedom for the community to preserve itself, but the freedom for the community to change its values, to change its practices. So that freedom to change, freedom in transformation, freedom in self-transformation. Now it's tricky because it's not entirely divorced from the freedom to be. It's related to the freedom to be. So it means that two different things have to be thought about at the same time. Continuity and change. Meaning for transformation to take place, there has to be something that is changed. So it's a dialectic of being and becoming. It's a relationship between the state of being, or what is, with the process of becoming, motivated by what ought to be, what could be and what should be. So the idea is that the modern world is fraught with oughts. Fraught with oughts. What does fraught mean? It means we're suffering from what could be and what should be, but is not. We're suffering from a potential impossibility for change that has not happened yet. So it's a different kind of suffering. It's not a suffering of harm to our being. It's a suffering of the unrealized character of our potential. So this dialectic of being and becoming, it's a dialectic, to use Kant and Hegel's language, of nature and spirit. So nature, capital N nature, this metaphysical object nature, refers to everything that exists. Everything that exists and everything that has come into existence through cultural, historical, social evolution. So everything that you're born into, everything that's natural to you, everything that's given in the world as it is, the state of being, including the being that became in the past and changed in the past, but now is what is, and spirit. Dialectic of nature and spirit. Spirit, what is animating and motivating, what is moving the world in a process of change. Spirit, the word is Geist, and Geist can also be translated as mind or consciousness. So the idea is that consciousness is really a function of change, of becoming, or of freedom. Meaning, we'll see starting with Rousseau tomorrow night and continuing on Thursday, the modern conception of freedom is really due to Rousseau. Meaning, Rousseau connects human reason with freedom. Meaning, why are we conscious in a way that the animals are not? Because we're free in a way that the animals are not. Meaning, we're free to transform our nature in a way that the animals are not. And therefore, we're conscious in a way that the animals are not. But we'll get there. We'll get there tomorrow night. So, transformation, freedom, change that we can take responsibility for. Change that brings about the new and the different from the given and the same. How does the new and the different emerge from the given and the same? And how are we conscious subjects of that process? So not objects of change, but subjects of change. Not change that happens to us, but change that we do and we can take responsibility for. That's what freedom means. Now, I use some Nietzsche language here to help illustrate it, which is self-overcoming. It's helpful because it introduces another term that we'll be dealing with Marx, and that's Aufhebung, or sublation. So self-overcoming, so the process of becoming, process of transformation, that's a process of self-overcoming, meaning a change and transformation that happens from within, not just by external circumstances. So again, not being an object of change, but being a subject of change. So self-overcoming, or Selbstaufhebung, and Aufhebung is this funny word in German that's very ordinary word in German. It just means to take up. So Selbstaufhebung would mean to take oneself up. It's translated into English in philosophical texts in this bizarre Latin word sublation, which doesn't really mean anything colloquially. but self-overcoming. Now, the dialectic here is paradoxical, meaning every transformation, every dialectic of continuity and change, every dialectic of being and becoming involves two contradictory things. It's hard for us to think continuity and change at the same time. And so when we're thinking about this process of transformation, our thinking about it will be affected thusly. Meaning self-overcoming will look like two contradictory things. It will look like a self-fulfillment, but it will also look like a self-negation. It will look like the realization of an innate potential, but also the negation of a state of being. It will look like a self-completion, but also as a self-transcendence. It will look like a self-realization, but also a self-abolition. Now, the self here doesn't mean the personal self. It doesn't mean the individual self. Although in Nietzsche, he tended to put it that way in terms of the Selbstverständnis. But that's Nietzsche. That's not Kant, Hegel, and Marx, or Rousseau. So self here means the community or the society. In this case, it would mean capitalism, meaning how did Marx understood socialism or communism? He understood it as the self-overcoming of capitalism. That paradoxically or contradictorily would look like both the fulfillment of capitalism and the negation of capitalism. It would look like the completion of capitalism and the transcendence of capitalism. It will look like the realization of capitalism, but also the abolition of capitalism. And that's because it will be a transformative process in which there will be both continuity and change. And because it will be a self-contradictory process, it will be confusing. Meaning, people will take opposite sides in the values and practices of that process of change. And yet, people on opposite sides will both contribute to the change. And the change will be the realization of both sides and neither side in the struggle through that contradictory process of change. So Marx has a very peculiar notion of capitalism. It's not like a bad system. It's not like a wrong value system or something. It's not a wrong value. It's rather a contradictory reality in which overcoming that contradictory reality will itself be a contradictory process. So this is going to be our challenge in this course. How do we think about that? But we'll see that it actually predates Marx. Meaning for the first 2 weeks of the course, we'll be reading really Marx's own bookshelf. We'll be reading from the thinkers immediately preceding him that Marx was influenced by. So Rousseau, Adam Smith, Kant, and Hegel, and how the 19th century, as Louis Menand put it, required a second Enlightenment. So why did the 19th century require a second Enlightenment? Why were Marx and Engels the philosophes of a second Enlightenment? Because the first Enlightenment was about bourgeois society. It was about the emergence of bourgeois freedom out of traditional civilization. The second Enlightenment was necessary because of capitalism. Because capitalism makes that bourgeois philosophy of freedom inadequate to the task of overcoming capitalism. Again, this is something that we'll get into in more detail. But the idea is that we're still in this process of change that was unleashed by bourgeois society. We're still living in bourgeois freedom from traditional civilization. But this society already points beyond that form of freedom to something beyond capitalism. So capitalism is a crisis of bourgeois freedom. So that's why Horkheimer, in his aphorism, says, okay, socialism is supposed to be free, but we're living in a society that's liberal and that considers itself free, so it's not terribly clear what that means. oh, socialism is going to be about freedom, but aren't we already free? Well, no, we have to clarify how we are free and unfree in this society, and actually how our freedom has led to our unfreedom in capitalism. So how bourgeois emancipation, bourgeois freedom, freedom from traditional civilization, from the caste system, has led us into a new form of unfreedom, and that is capitalism. Or we could say how the freedom that we have in bourgeois society became alienated in capitalism. So we live in an alienated form of freedom in capitalism. And we need to overcome that now, according to Marxism. All right, and like I said, it sort of starts with Rousseau, thinking about this problem. So we have one final thing to look at tonight that will transition us into Rousseau for tomorrow night. And that's another contemporary intellectual historian, James Miller, who also teaches in New York, or taught in New York. He might be retired now. And this is from his introduction to Rousseau's Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. So I'll share my screen with you guys here. Okay. So here's James Miller. He's probably most famous for his book called The Passion of Michel Foucault, which is a critique of Foucault. So he wrote an introduction to Rousseau's Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. He also wrote a essay that has some of this language, some of this phraseology, some of these ideas in it, called The Abyss of Philosophy. So let's see what he has to say about Rousseau. He says, the principle of freedom and its corollary, perfectibility, that's one of the main concepts introduced in the reading for tomorrow in the second discourse, in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, suggests that the possibilities for being human are both multiple and literally endless. So the absolute movement of becoming, an open-ended process of freedom. Contemporaries, like Kant, well understood the novelty and radical implications of Rousseau's new principle of freedom and appreciated his unusual stress on history as the site where the true nature of our species is simultaneously realized and perverted, revealed and distorted. A new way of thinking about the human condition had appeared. As Hegel put it, quote, the principle of freedom dawned on the world in Rousseau and gave infinite strength to man, who thus apprehended himself as infinite. That's what we're going to be talking about in this course. Because it was Rousseau who influenced Kant. It was Rousseau who influenced Adam Smith. It was Rousseau who influenced Hegel. It's Rousseau who influences Marx, as we will see. Meaning critical philosophy came about when Kant, who was already an established philosopher, read Rousseau, and then he realized he had to change his philosophy completely. So he spent 10 years formulating his new philosophy, and then he came out with his critical philosophy and the works that we know Kant for. Adam Smith, prior to that, was part of the Scottish Enlightenment, and he read Rousseau, and he's the first person to translate into English the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality that we're reading for tomorrow. And he writes to the Edinburgh Review, which is the journal of the Scottish Enlightenment. He says, oh, there's someone over on the continent who's thinking like us, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Here's some things that he's written. See, he's on the same page with us. And then we'll see how his book on the Wealth of Nations is an attempt to elaborate a lot of what Rousseau discusses in both the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality and on the Social Contract. So the two readings that we will be doing this week from Rousseau. With this new way of thinking about freedom, the birth of social theory, the birth of critical social theory, the birth of critique in this modern way, starts with Rousseau. So that's why we are starting with Rousseau in the course. Because what Pippin called the Kantian aftermath is actually the Rousseauian aftermath. All right. I think that's all for tonight. We went a little bit longer than I expected to, but that's okay. We kind of established some main themes. So I will set up a discussion thread for tomorrow for the discourse and the origin of inequality. And like I said, everyone is encouraged, but not everyone is required to post notes to the discussion thread on the reading, things that you'd like us to raise in class. Really just 2 or 3 bullet points, either a response to the text or a question, or maybe a short passage that you'd like us to discuss in class. I'll set up the discussion threads for tomorrow and for Thursday on Canvas so that you can post to them. We will take volunteers on Thursday for next week. We won't have volunteers for tomorrow or for Thursday. We'll take volunteers on Thursday for Adam Smith and Kant and Constant and Hegel. All right, guys. Have a good evening, or if you're in a different time zone, rest of the day. And I will see you guys tomorrow night. I'm going to send an announcement to remind you. 6:30 tomorrow, so we'll start 15 minutes early tomorrow. And sorry for the inconvenience of that, but we will do that and only meet for an hour tomorrow. So 6:30 to 7:30, but I'll send an announcement reminding you guys. All right. Ciao.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.